Hi there and welcome to this lecture for Philosophy of Psychology, the summer course week 6. And in this lecture we're going to talk about delusion and confabulation. And this is in chapter 7 of the textbook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the textbook and explain these ideas and how we can think about them and how they're relevant to the things that we've talked about in this course. And so we'll draw out their significance in this lecture. So we talk about delusion. It's an observable feature of psychiatric disorders like dementia, amnesia, or schizophrenia. It's a belief that's held despite obvious counter evidence and which is not explained by the person's social, cultural, and religious background. So it's a belief that's held despite evidence that pointed out to the contrary, and is not due simply to a feature of their culture, cultural or religious background, but has some other kind of basis. And here we see a list of some common sort of themes of delusions. The Capgras delusion, in which a family member, often a partner, is thought to be an imposter, not sort of the real person. The Cotard delusion, the delusion of being dead, of having suffered death. And there's other delusions here about being followed, about not seeing yourself in the mirror. Somatoparaphrenia is the sense of having a limb that's not yours. Not being aware that your left arm is paralyzed is anosognosia for hemiplegia. So there's a number of things here. Erotomania is the sense of another person secretly in love with you, even if that person has discouraged the idea. There are also the delusion of grandiosity, the idea that a person has special talents, and the delusion of persecution as well. That other people are hostile and intend to cause harm, and sometimes these delusions can sort of overlap. Often they're just sort of separate, and there's only one that a person is sort of suffering from. But they seem to have this sort of focus of this sort of false belief that's at the core of them. So it's important to sort of investigate whether that makes sense and where that idea comes from. So one popular theory about delusions has been that they form in response to abnormal experiences. So people with the Capgras delusion, who believe a family member or partner is an imposter, often have an abnormal experience, it's thought, when seeing a familiar face. So they visually recognize the features, but they're unable to experience that affective form of familiarity, that kind of emotional sort of connection. And that seems to cause this sense of recognizing, but not having that affective connection. So Stone and Young argue that the Capgras delusion, in addition, involves a reasoning bias, a bias towards observational adequacy over doxastic conservatism. The idea here is that beliefs can serve these two kind of tendencies, and a delusion emerges as a way of kind of rationalizing this abnormal experience that's had. So a healthy belief system will manage two tasks which involve, on the one hand, incorporating new ideas and information, and that's observational adequacy. When you see something, when you become aware of something, you incorporate it into your belief system. And the other part, the doxastic conservatism, is keeping beliefs as long as possible. So making sure that we sort of maintain a coherence in our sort of existing belief system. So people with the Capgras delusion are said to be biased towards the former, so biased towards observational adequacy. So they're kind of quick to revise their beliefs in the light of an unusual or abnormal experience. So the thought is, if you didn't have this kind of bias, this kind of reasoning bias towards observational adequacy, you would sort of reject this sort of experience, this abnormal experience, which might lead to the illusion. But because there's this bias towards new ideas and information, that piece is sort of automatically integrated and takes precedence over the sort of existing beliefs that are part of the system already, and comes to be sort of integrated into it very quickly. So it's allegedly these two things: an abnormal experience and then a reasoning bias, which kind of sits on top of that, is one theory of how this happens. Some people disagree that it requires a reasoning bias, and as we'll see, there are differences about what kind of things delusions are in terms of beliefs as well. So we can ask, are delusions in fact beliefs? And there are two arguments against the view that delusions are actually beliefs. And the first is that they don't seem to be responsive to evidence like beliefs. They don't seem to sort of respond to evidence in the same way. They don't respond to when somebody points out a counterpoint, a counterexample. They're not sort of responsive in the same way. Delusions also don't seem to guide action like beliefs are supposed to do. That's the thought, that they're not sort of action guiding in the way that beliefs are. So if they're not responsive to evidence, and if they're not action guiding, they don't seem to be beliefs. So doxasticism is the view that delusions are beliefs. So these two are anti-doxastic arguments. They're arguing that delusions are not in fact beliefs. So without being responsive to evidence, it's thought that a belief would be a bit like imagination or wishful thinking. However, many beliefs also seem impervious to evidence. Many of our normal beliefs seem impervious to evidence, like, for example, prejudice often persists despite evidence to the contrary. Superstition, which is often sort of believed and continues to be believed despite evidence to the contrary. Religious beliefs continue to be believed despite the fact that they don't hang with a lot of other things that a society or people in general believe. So how much does the fact that they're not responsive actually make delusions unique, or make them sort of different from ordinary beliefs? We could also say that some delusions do seem to guide action, in the kind of the sort of persecution delusion, staying away from a family that is sort of doing the persecuting is a feature of that delusion. And also independent factors may affect motivation to act. So a person may not act on their belief or their delusion because they're lacking confidence. Maybe they're fearing a sanction or ostracism. So it doesn't seem to be it doesn't really seem to be that convincing that because they sort of don't guide action, they're not actually beliefs. It's hard to say that there's anything that definitively here separates delusions from beliefs, because beliefs are sometimes not responsive to evidence. Beliefs also might not guide action for a number of reasons as well. Another question is whether delusions exhibit rational thinking. And one thing that researchers have focused on here are probabilistic reasoning abnormalities. And one of these is the jumping to conclusions bias, which, as it states, is the bias of jumping to a conclusion quickly before the evidence seems to be available. And this was in the study by Hook, Garrity, and Hemsley in 1988, where participants were shown two jars with beads of two colors in ratios of 80:20 and 20:80. A sequence of beads is shown apparently from one of the jars, and participants had to guess which jar. Participants with delusions tended to jump to conclusions, guessing after fewer draws than the other contestants, who were sort of non-delusional. So those with suffering from delusions seem to have this habit of jumping to conclusions, of making their of coming to their conclusion more quickly than other participants. Now, it could be argued, though, that although the jumping to conclusions bias is abnormal, it's not irrational. In other words, it doesn't sort of violate norms of rationality. And in this experiment, this jumping to conclusions bias experiment, although those with delusions drew less beads, they formed a conclusion that had a 97% probability of being true. So that doesn't seem to be an irrational thing to sort of jump to a conclusion when it's a 97% probability of being true. That seems pretty standard, and pretty much like what we would consider normal behavior in other contexts. You would bring an umbrella if there was a 97% chance of rain. Right? So it's possible that those without delusions have some kind of conservative bias here, that they're not jumping in as quickly, as much as we could say that there's a jumping to conclusions bias. So again, it's not clear that there's irrational thinking here, that we can sort of charge those with delusions, that we can charge them with irrational thinking. It's not clear from this experiment that we can. So delusions seem to be continuous with non-delusional beliefs, and we've outlined and looked at a couple of studies that want to separate delusions and say that they are discontinuous with beliefs, or they're irrational in some way, but we've seen that it's hard to sustain those claims. They don't seem to be irrational in a distinctive way. In other words, in a way different from the way people are irrational in general. And they don't seem to exhibit biases any differently than the way people are biased in general. So we're still left with the question, what distinguishes a delusion, say a persecutory delusion, the Capgras delusion, from the irrational belief that Linda is more likely to be a feminist bank teller than just a bank teller? As we saw, a lot of people are likely to sort of go with that belief, even though on reflection we see it's a violation of the conjunction fallacy, but it's still the popular choice. So we're left with this question: are they more harmful or threatening to our sense of self? Are delusions more harmful and threatening than other beliefs? Or should we maybe give up the idea that there is a principal distinction between delusions and other rational beliefs? All right, so now let's look at the idea of confabulation. Confabulation often refers clinically to a symptom of disorders that involve severe memory impairment, like dementia or amnesia, can also involve schizophrenia. And the symptoms are a lack of awareness, there's no motivation to lie, and the stories and the sort of confabulations can range from sort of ordinary to totally unrealistic. They often involve fabricated memories, and are also understood to involve false beliefs about the world that are held in spite of evidence to the contrary. The content of fabulation, it could be fantastic or mundane. When confabulations are provoked, in other words, when they are a response to a request or a question from somebody else, they tend to be mundane, they tend to be ordinary. Confabulation can also occur in the absence of any known pathology or brain injury. And in fact, we've seen this when we've talked about the stockings experiment, when people sort of prefer the item to their right when picking a series of items. And in the stockings experiment, all the stockings are the same and people have a preference for the one that's to their right. But they will confabulate about that choice and say they made it on other grounds. So we know confabulation is not is present in cases where there's no pathology as well. It's just something people do when they don't understand why they do things. So this is an interesting sort of question where it involves these sort of clinical cases. Now, Daniel Schachter described what he called the 7 sins of memory, and they are so transience, reduced memory over time. This is a form of forgetting. So the first 3 as forms of forgetting are sins of omission. The second is blocking, which is failing to recall the name of a person you need, inability to remember the needed information when you need it. The third one, absent-mindedness, reduced memory due to failure to paying attention, losing your keys, or forgetting a lunch date. So they're all forgetting something you should be able to remember. Sins of commission are remembering more than was actually experienced, or even differently than it was experienced. And we see this with persistence, the resurgence of unwanted or disturbing memories we'd like to forget, misattribution, assigning a memory to the wrong source, biases, influence of current knowledge on our memory for past events. So here there's a distortion from our current sort of standpoint, which influences and infects how we think about the past. And the final one, suggestibility, altering a memory because of misleading information, developing false memories for events that did not happen. Interesting cases of that have used examples where, say, a number of people have seen a kind of staged accident, a sort of theft, or a car accident or something like that. And then people's memory of the event can be altered based on the language used. So if you describe the event in a violent way, say the cars smashing together, that will change people's memory of the event versus if you describe the situation as the cars coming together. People will sort of, our memories are suggestible in that way. They can be distorted by the suggestions that we make about them in the present. So patients with brain damage distort the past in a similar way to people who fabricate memories to present themselves in a better light. There are thought to be some positive effects on mood rate regulation of this self-enhancing type of memory distortion. So there seem to be these common faults of memory, these sort of, if we call them these 7 sins like Schachter, but they're not different in kind from the kind of scenarios that feature in confabulation. And the most common ones in confabulation are misattribution and bias. However, they're common faults of memory, and everybody can be influenced or have the memory distorted in these ways, and we all forget things at the moments when we need them. So there's nothing specific about confabulation here about these memory faults. So we might ask here, what is the function of memory? Maybe that will give us a clue to sort of thinking about what confabulation is doing here. And people talk about 2 kind of main functions. One is to contribute to knowledge of the past. So memory sort of helps us maintain and keep that sort of knowledge of the past and that sort of coherence of the past in relation to the future, that we can tell a coherent story. And secondly, it ensures maintenance of a coherent sense of self, that it makes sure that it's in line with our current self concepts. So memories are sometimes altered to preserve a current consistent sense of self, and the past may be rewritten so it's in line with our current self concept, or indeed the present may be redescribed in a way that makes it more continuous with knowledge of the past. So we've got a potential sort of consistency bias here when we kind of rewrite the past so that it's in line with our current kind of concept of who we are, our current concept of self. And we've got a kind of updating failure when we redescribe the present in a way that makes it more continuous with knowledge of the past. So maybe we've sort of we've grown in a way that's challenged our self-conception, and we have to rewrite who we are in a way that makes it consistent with our knowledge of the past. Both of these things may be features of memory, but we can see that they may be in tension in some cases. That to sort of maintain an accurate knowledge of the past may create tension in maintaining a current coherent sense of self, and vice versa. Now, psychologists distinguish between reproductive and reconstructive memory. And reproductive memory is when stored information is retrieved and becomes the content of a belief about the past. So I remember something specific, and that forms my belief about the past. In reconstructive memory, stored information is combined with existing knowledge to construct a belief about the past. So here the belief is constructed. It's not built solely from memory, but we're using, almost like a sort of detective, we're using clues and ideas in the present to help us kind of reconstruct that sort of belief about the past. So in a reproductive system, there may be gaps and errors where info cannot be retrieved, where we just can't get the information, and there may be gaps and errors in the system. In a reconstructive system, however, there may be distortions, since the interpretation that makes sense to the person may not correspond with how the event was actually experienced. So again, there seems to be considerable continuity between memory distortions in clinical and non-clinical contexts. And it's possible that the reconstructive account of memory may account for those distortions, where we try to fill in the gaps with plausible inferences. So that's sort of what's happening in a distorted memory. We're trying to sort of fill in the gaps where we can't make out, we don't have that sort of information about what happened, and we're trying to reconstruct it. And that might be a common thing across clinical and non-clinical contexts. So again, nothing specific here about confabulation that sort of makes it different to processes that work in other contexts. Okay, and finally, I just wanted to remind you about the final exam, which is available on Saturday, and it will be available through Tuesday, July the 9th. So the final exam is the same as the exam 1 and exam 2. It's essay type questions, and you'll have 2 hours to do the exam. So set aside a time where you can complete the exam in one sitting, and make sure you do the weekly assignments first of all, the markup assignment, the discussion, the voice thread, and the quiz, and then you can sort of focus on the exam, which, like I said, will be available to next Tuesday. So good luck, and reach out if you need anything along the way.